A war hero went into the frozen wilderness seeking solitude. But what he found was a secret someone was willing to kill to keep. It was a 4-week-old German Shepherd puppy, tied to a tree, the only living witness to a brutal crime. The story of their survival will touch your soul, and every share helps us find justice for animals like him. Before we delve into their incredible journey, your subscription helps our Voice of Paws family continue to give a voice to those who cannot speak for themselves. The silence was the point. For John, a man in his early 50s whose face was a roadmap of harsh sun and harder memories, silence was not an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was the only thing that could fill the vast, echoing spaces the army had carved inside him. Here, deep in the snow-draped forests of Colorado, the silence was absolute. A thick, white blanket that smothered the world, and on good days, the ghosts that walked with him. His life in the small cabin was one of rigid routine. Up before dawn, coffee brewed black. A long walk before the sun crested the peaks. It was a soldier's discipline applied to a life of peace, the only way he knew to keep the chaos at bay. John's tall frame moved with a quiet economy, a slight stiffness in his left knee, the only outward sign of the life he'd left behind. His hair, once dark, was now a close-cropped silver, and his eyes, a clear, sharp blue, held a permanent watchfulness. He sought this profound quiet, this cathedral of pine and snow, to forget the noise. But the forest had its own language, the soft thump of snow falling from a heavy bough, the whisper of wind through the needles, the distant crack of a frozen branch. These were clean sounds, honest sounds. They were nothing like the ones that ambushed him in his sleep. Today, the snow was deep, his boots sinking with a soft crunch. That was the only testament to his existence. The air was so cold it felt sharp in his lungs, each breath a small victory against the elements. He walked his usual path, a trail he had worn himself, a loop that took him far enough from his cabin to feel lost, but close enough to always find his way back. He was halfway through his circuit when he stopped. It was a sound so faint, so alien to the forest's vocabulary, that his mind almost dismissed it. A thin, high-pitched whine, like a wire vibrating in the wind. He stood perfectly still, head cocked, his senses honed by years of training to isolate threats. It came again, weaker this time, almost swallowed by the vastness. It wasn't the wind. It was life, and it was in distress. He turned from his path, moving into the deeper woods, his boots now plunging into untouched powder. He moved with purpose, his earlier lethargy gone, replaced by the focused energy of a rescuer. The sound guided him, a fragile thread in the immense cold. He found it at the base of a towering ponderosa pine. The sight made the cold air in his lungs turn to ice. It was a puppy, impossibly small, a tiny bundle of black and tan fur against the dark bark. It was a German Shepherd, no more than 4 weeks old. Its eyes barely opened to the world that had been so cruel. A thin, coarse rope was wrapped around its body and tied to the tree, pulled so tight that its tiny frame was contorted. It had stopped struggling. The whimper he had heard was the last flicker of a life about to be extinguished. Its body trembled in violent, uncontrollable spasms, not from the cold alone, but from the final stages of exhaustion and fear. For a moment, John just stared, a hot, unfamiliar rage building in his chest. Who does this? Who looks at a creature this helpless and decides its fate is to freeze to death, alone and terrified, in the middle of nowhere? The question was a poisoned dart, and it pierced the careful numbness he had cultivated for years. He knelt in the snow, his bad knee screaming in protest, but he ignored it. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "I've got you." His fingers, clumsy from the cold, fumbled with the knot. It was pulled cruelly tight. Panic, an old enemy, threatened to surface. He pushed it down, his training taking over. He pulled his service knife from its sheath on his belt. The blade was sharp and steady in his hand. With surgical precision, he slid the tip between the puppy's shivering body and the rope. And with one clean slice, the tension gave way. The puppy collapsed into the snow, a limp, pathetic heap. John quickly sheathed his knife and gently scooped it up. It weighed almost nothing. He could feel the frantic, shallow beat of its heart against his palm. Without a second thought, he unzipped his heavy winter coat, tucking the tiny, frozen body against the warmth of his chest. He zipped the coat back up, creating a small, dark, warm cavern for the dying creature. He turned and headed back, moving as quickly as the deep snow would allow. His own warmth, his own life force, was the puppy's only chance. Every step was a prayer. The silence of the forest was no longer peaceful. It was menacing, a predator waiting for this small life to fail. For the first time in years, John felt a profound sense of responsibility. A clear and urgent mission that had nothing to do with orders or survival. It was a duty to this small, broken thing he now carried against his heart. A life he had sworn to protect from the suffocating silence of the snow. The cabin door slammed shut, its heavy thud a stark punctuation mark against the howl of the wind outside. Inside, the air was still and warm, smelling of pine smoke from the embers glowing in the stone hearth. John moved with an urgency that his quiet life had not demanded in years. He shrugged off his snow-caked coat, laying it carefully on the floor, and gently lifted the puppy from its warm pocket. The small creature was limp in his large, calloused hands, its breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. His first priority was warmth. He found an old cardboard box and lined it with his softest flannel shirt, creating a makeshift nest. He placed the box near the hearth, close enough for the radiant heat but far enough to avoid overheating the fragile body. The puppy lay motionless on the soft fabric, a stark contrast of black and tan against the red plaid. For a moment, watching its stillness, John felt a familiar dread, the cold fear that he was already too late. He pushed it aside. The mission was not over. Next was hydration and nourishment. He knew a puppy this young couldn't survive long without its mother's milk. Rummaging through his sparse pantry, he found a can of evaporated milk. He remembered a field medic once telling him a mixture of milk, water, a little sugar, and an egg yolk could serve as an emergency formula for orphaned animals. He worked quickly. His hands, which had once field-stripped a rifle in the dark, now carefully measuring drops of water into a small bowl. He found an eyedropper in an old first aid kit and sterilized it in boiling water. The first feeding was a battle of patience. He cradled the puppy's head in one hand, the eyedropper in the other. He squeezed a single drop onto its pale lips. It didn't respond. He tried again. A tiny pink tongue flickered out. Tasting the liquid, he squeezed another drop, and another. The process was painstakingly slow, a testament to the fragile thread holding the puppy to life. The night wore on. John did not sleep. He sat in his worn armchair, watching the box, getting up every hour to administer a few more precious drops of milk. The cabin, usually a fortress of solitude, was now a field hospital. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a fragile, hopeful tension. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the window, he looked down at the tiny creature. He needed to call it something. A name was an anchor, a claim on life. He thought of its resilience, its fight to survive against impossible odds. "Bear," he whispered into the quiet room. "Your name is Bear. You've got to be strong like one." As if hearing him, the puppy stirred. It was not a shiver this time, but a deliberate movement. Its tiny head lifted a fraction of an inch from the flannel. Then its eyes, which had been sealed in a haze of near death, opened fully. They were a deep, soulful brown, and for the first time, They focused on John. A connection was made, a silent acknowledgement that passed between the weary man and the recovering animal. A wave of relief so profound it felt like a physical blow washed over John. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for hours. With the immediate crisis averted, Bear sleeping a more natural, healing sleep, John's mind returned to the forest. He walked over to his coat, which lay discarded on the floor. He reached into the pocket and pulled out the piece of rope he had cut from the tree. In the clear light of morning, it looked even more peculiar. This was no ordinary twine or utility rope. It was a thin, braided leather cord, dyed a deep, vibrant blue. Woven into the braid were fine, shimmering threads of silver that caught the light. It was decorative, something one might find in a craft store or on a handmade piece of jewelry. It was entirely the wrong object for such a brutal purpose. The image of that beautiful, cruel cord wrapped around Bear's tiny body sent another jolt of anger through him. This was not the work of someone simply overwhelmed. The choice of rope felt personal, almost ritualistic. The deliberate cruelty of it, leaving an animal to die slowly, combined with this strange ornamental cord, painted a dark picture in his mind. This was wrong on a level that went beyond simple abandonment. He looked from the cord in his hand to the sleeping puppy in the box. He was Bear's protector now, and that meant finding out who did this. John walked over to the old rotary phone on his wall, the cord a damning piece of evidence in his hand, and dialed the number for the county sheriff's office. The call was brief and to the point. John's voice was steady as he spoke to the dispatcher, reporting an act of animal cruelty at his location. He omitted nothing, but added no emotion, relaying the facts with the precision of a field report. After he hung up the old rotary phone, the cabin fell silent again. But the nature of the silence had changed. It was no longer a peaceful void, but a space filled with waiting. He glanced over at the box by the hearth. Bear was awake, his tiny black ears twitching. He made a soft mewling sound, and with a monumental effort, pushed himself up on wobbly legs. He stood for a shaky second before tumbling back onto the soft flannel. John felt a protective surge, a fierce commitment to the small life that was fighting so hard. An hour later, the crunch of tires on the snowy path announced the sheriff's arrival. The man who stepped out of the patrol vehicle was Sheriff Miller, a name John had known for 30 years. Miller was built like the mountains he policed, broad and sturdy, with a face weathered by countless Colorado winters. His demeanor was calm and pragmatic, but his eyes, when they met John's, held the easy familiarity of a long and unspoken friendship. They had grown up together before life had sent them on wildly different paths. "John?" Miller said with a nod, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Dispatch said you found something ugly." "Uglier than usual, Frank," John replied, leading him inside. Miller's professional gaze swept the room before landing on the box. He walked over and looked down at Bear, who stared back with wide, innocent eyes. A flicker of sympathy crossed the sheriff's face. "Poor little thing. Some people have no heart. We'll put out a notice. See if anyone's missing a pup, though I doubt it. This has the feel of a dump and run." "It's more than that," John said quietly. He held out the piece of blue and silver cord. "This is what he was tied with." John said, "Bold. John. And of thelowbury.com. John. 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 Bold. Dot. John. OneLober.com. Sheriff Miller took the cord. He turned it over in his gloved fingers, his expression shifting from one of professional pity to sharp, focused attention. The easygoing demeanor vanished, replaced by the keen instinct of a lawman. He rubbed the braided leather between his thumb and forefinger. "Well now," he said, his voice low, "that's not baling twine. That's not a clothesline. What in the world is this?" He held it up to the light from the window, the silver threads gleaming. "This changes things, John. This is specific. It's intentional." He pulled out his radio, his voice now crisp and authoritative. "Mary, it's Frank. I want you to run a welfare check. Start with the off-gridders and homesteaders out past Miller's Creek, anyone we haven't heard from in a while. Focus on anyone who's an artist, a craftsman, you understand? Someone who might work with materials like this." He gave John a grim look. "I'll be back." With that, he was gone, leaving John alone again with the sleeping puppy and a growing sense of dread. 3 hours later, as dusk began to bleed across the snow, Miller's patrol car returned. This time, he didn't park by the path. He drove right up to the cabin, and when he got out, John could see the grim set of his jaw. The sheriff's face looked older than it had that morning. "We found him, John," Miller said as he stepped inside, his voice heavy. He didn't look at the puppy. He looked at John, an old artisan. Name of Samuel Peterson. Lived alone in a cabin about 5 miles deeper in the woods. Kept to himself, made handcrafted leather goods. Beautiful stuff. He paused, taking off his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. It was a robbery gone wrong. Place was ransacked. Sam didn't make it. And in his workshop, on a bench, we found a dozen spools of this exact same cord. Blue leather, silver thread. It was his signature. The unspoken question that had been hanging in the air since John found the cord was finally answered. And the truth was colder than any winter storm. John looked over at the cardboard box, at the tiny German shepherd puppy, curled up on the flannel, a picture of perfect innocence. Bear was not an unwanted animal. He was a loose end, a piece of evidence. Miller followed his gaze, his voice barely a whisper. The puppy must have been his. John. They killed Samuel, and then they took the pup. They drove him out here and tied him to that tree, leaving him to freeze. They figured no one would ever find him, and no one would ever connect him back to Sam's cabin. He looked at John, his eyes filled with a terrible certainty. That little guy in the box. He's the only living thing that saw their faces. He's the only witness. The weight of Sheriff Miller's words settled in the small cabin, heavier than the snow piling up outside. Bear, now the sole witness to a brutal murder, let out a soft sigh in his sleep, oblivious to his own significance. John stared at the puppy, his mission suddenly expanding beyond simple survival. He was no longer just a rescuer. He was a guardian, a protector of the only innocent soul left in this dark affair. The case is officially a homicide, Miller stated, his voice a low rumble that cut through the quiet. The way they left the puppy, the specific cord they used, it all points to a crime of opportunity. Not professional killers, amateurs, probably local. He began to pace the small floor, the gears of the investigation turning visibly in his mind. We've got a group of young men, known for petty theft, who've suddenly come into some money, flashing cash around town that they can't account for. It's a thin lead, but with what happened to Sam Peterson, it's the only one we have. Miller stopped pacing and turned to John, his gaze intense. I need you to go back there, John. Not physically, in your head. You were trained to see things people miss. I need you to walk that path again. From the moment you heard the sound to the moment you cut him free. Push past the horror of it. See the scene. Tell me what you saw. John closed his eyes. For years he had actively fought against this kind of recall, pushing back memories that threatened to pull him under. But now he willingly dove in. The hunter's instinct, long dormant, awoke. He was on the path again, the cold air sharp, the snow deep. He let the emotion of finding Bear fall away, replacing it with the cold, analytical focus of a tracker. He saw the towering ponderosa pine, the small, dark shape against its trunk. He forced himself to see the surroundings, the canvas of the crime scene. And then he found it. A detail his mind had recorded but his conscious self had dismissed as unimportant. "A boot print," he said, his eyes still closed. "To the left of the tree." The snow was starting to cover it, but I saw it. The tread was a diamond pattern, but with a weird circular logo in the heel. It wasn't a work boot, Frank. It was a fashion boot, the kind kids wear. Miller listened intently, not interrupting. "And the road?" John continued, his mind's eye panning back. "The dirt road that leads to that clearing. I remember seeing tire tracks. They were fresh. An older model SUV or truck, I think. The tracks were wide. But the tread wasn't standard. It was aggressive, like expensive off-road tires on an old vehicle. It's a strange combination." He opened his eyes and looked at Miller. The sheriff's face was lit with a grim excitement. He pulled out a small notepad, a diamond tread with a circle logo, aggressive tires on an old truck. He scribbled furiously. "One of the kids on our list, a punk named Kyle, wears nothing but Viper brand boots. They have that exact logo. And his friend, Dylan, drives a beat-up 90s Bronco with brand new mud tires he was bragging about last week." The pieces were slotting into place. John's memories were not just observations. They were links in a chain, connecting the suspects directly to the remote, isolated spot where Bear was left to die. Miller clapped a hand on John's shoulder. "You just put them at the scene, John. This is what we needed." The sheriff left with a new urgency. The waiting that followed was different. It was the tense, quiet anticipation before a dawn raid. John spent the time caring for Bear, who was growing stronger by the hour, even attempting a playful nibble on John's finger. That evening the phone rang. "We got them," Miller's voice said, weary but triumphant. "All three of them. Your intel was perfect. We found Sam Peterson's stolen crafts in their apartment, along with muddy boots matching the tread you described. They folded as soon as we presented the evidence. They confessed to everything." He paused for a moment. "They said they dumped the dog because its whimpering was getting on their nerves. They tied it up with the stolen cord because they thought it was funny. Justice had been served. The hunters had found their prey." John hung up the phone and looked down at Bear, who was now asleep at his feet. The world was a safe place for him now. John's instincts, the very part of him he had once considered a curse, had been redeemed. They had not only saved an innocent life, but they had also honored the life that was lost. He reached down and stroked Bear's soft fur. The small puppy, a victim and a witness, was finally just a dog again, and he was home. News in a small mountain town travels faster than a winter wind. The story of the murder of old Samuel Peterson, the culprit's capture, and the role a reclusive veteran and a tiny puppy played in it, all became local legend overnight. For the first time in a decade, when John drove into town for supplies, people didn't look away. The clerk at the general store, a woman who had never offered more than a polite nod, insisted his coffee was on the house. A rancher he barely knew tipped his hat and said, "Good work, John." He was no longer the ghost in the woods, a shadow of past wars. He was a part of the community again, a quiet hero they were proud to claim as their own. The attention was unfamiliar, and at first, uncomfortable, but it slowly chipped away at the wall he had built around himself. The true change, however, was happening within the four walls of his cabin. The rigid, self-imposed discipline that had governed John's life began to soften, its purpose replaced. His mornings were no longer just about solitary walks to quiet his mind. They were about a wagging tail, a wet nose, and a small, furry body that needed to be let outside. His days were punctuated by play, by teaching a clumsy puppy to sit, by cleaning up the inevitable messes. The silence of his home was filled with new sounds: the happy yips of a growing dog, the click of nails on the wood floor, the contented sigh of Bear sleeping at his feet. The nightmares did not vanish entirely, but their power was diminished. One night, a particularly bad one pulled him from sleep, his heart pounding, the scent of smoke and sand filling his senses. He sat bolt upright, gasping for air, but before the panic could take root, he felt a warm weight on the bed and a wet nose nudging his hand. He looked down into Bear's concerned brown eyes. He was not in a desert halfway around the world. He was home. He was safe. He wrapped his arms around the young dog, burying his face in its warm fur, and for the first time, the past began to feel like a distant country he no longer had to visit. Bear had become his anchor to the present. A few weeks later, Sheriff Miller stopped by, not with grim news, but with a clipboard. Samuel Peterson had no living relatives, he explained, sitting at John's small kitchen table. The town council agrees. There's only one home for this pup. We've finalized the paperwork. He's officially yours, John. John signed the papers, his hand steady. It was just a formality. Bear had been his from the moment he'd cut him free. But the signature felt significant, a promise etched in ink. He was no longer just a caretaker. He was family. The emptiness that had defined his life for so long was now filled with the unconditional love of a dog who owed him everything, and in return, gave him everything back. A year passed. Winter returned to the mountains, blanketing the world in a fresh layer of white. But this winter was different. John walked his old path, but he was not alone. At his side, trotting with a confident, easy gait, was Bear. He was no longer a tiny, helpless creature, but a magnificent, nearly full-grown German shepherd. His coat was a rich black and tan, his ears stood tall and alert, and his intelligent eyes missed nothing. They came to the clearing with the towering ponderosa pine. There was no hesitation in John's steps this time. They walked right up to the tree, its bark scarred but healed. It was not a place of horror anymore. It was a monument, the beginning of their story. Bear sat beside him, leaning his weight gently against John's leg, as if he understood. John rested a hand on the rough bark, a silent acknowledgement of the life lost and the two lives found. He looked down at Bear, who looked back up at him, tail giving a slow, steady wag. In that quiet moment, the cycle felt complete. The forest, once a refuge from his pain, was now simply a place of profound peace they shared together. The man had saved the puppy from the cold, and in doing so, had invited a warmth back into his own life he thought was gone forever. They turned from the tree and walked back toward home, two souls rescued by each other, their path ahead illuminated by the soft light of a new dawn. John and Bear's journey shows us that sometimes saving a life is how we truly save ourselves. The quietest acts of kindness can heal the deepest wounds, creating a bond that time cannot break. Thousands of other loyal hearts like Bear are waiting silently, hoping for their story to be heard. If you believe every soul deserves a voice, we invite you to become part of our family here at Voice of Paws and help us share their song.